Hello and welcome to another episode of Global Chit Chat, the show where we discuss matters pertaining to the global arena. And as always, joining me on the show is our expert on foreign policies and everything when it comes to geopolitics, Tridivesh Singh Beni. Tridivesh, welcome to Global Chit Chat once again.
Thank you very much. My pleasure. Thank you.
So, the Tridivesh, starting off, let's start with China once again. Though China has actually opened its border for travel and for business also, but we are witnessing that the kind of trajectory that China was expecting in terms of a rise in its economy and a sudden push to its economy, which was stagnant for 3 years because it basically closed down its borders because of the COVID-19. So how do you see this? That why is China not seeing that kind of a progression that it was thinking that it will see when it opened its borders?
Obviously, we know about what has happened over the last 2 months and how when China suddenly opened up, the cases increased. I mean, and there was pressure on the healthcare system. We know all about that. Now, the issue is that if you look at it annually, if you look at trade figures of China with the rest of the world annually, uh, there is an increase from 2021. But if you take the month of December itself, that reveals quite a bit in terms of the obviously a drop in exports and in imports. That is quite evident. Uh, Now, as you rightly pointed out, that the restrictions have been removed, and irrespective of the geopolitical differences, we do know how the world is interconnected, how supply chains are interconnected, and even, I mean, especially one is obviously at the global level, the other is the context of Southeast Asia itself. So countries like Vietnam, which have a very complex relationship with China, and which have geopolitical differences, and but obviously in terms of trade, they have robust economic linkages. And what had happened as a result of the COVID-19 restrictions was that Vietnamese Vietnam's trade with China took a hit, and I mean, obviously
Right.
now exports from Vietnam also, obviously, because there were restrictions. So at the land borders, for very very long, trucks were stranded and all that sort of thing was happening. And I don't think that all of a sudden uh, this is going to change. The restrictions have been removed, but it's going to take time before trade between China and its neighbors, with which it shares land borders, I mean, normalizes. But obviously
Correct.
countries are looking that to the fact that, okay, many countries which are dependent, I mean, as I've given you the example of Vietnam, if you look, for instance, at their uh, especially certain industries like related to agriculture, then even if you look at food commodities, fruits, vegetables, right? So there are close linkages in that sense between both countries. And obviously the Vietnamese uh, business community,
Correct.
especially in certain sectors, is looking to the opening up, so that your the because
The
they've taken a
businesses
hit
basically start to
as a
flow.
large. If you look, and what has also happened is that the trade deficit has increased over the last
Correct.
year, because obviously there has been a decrease in imports from China as well, but exports have taken a hit. So if you look at the trade deficit, there has been a that trade deficit with China has actually increased. That has been a major problem, and now Vietnam is obviously looking to resolve that, and even otherwise, I mean,
Correct.
they're interconnected in many ways. I mean, and certain, as I said, certain commodities, irrespective whether there have been tensions or not, that's what happens when you're interlinked. So there is a dependence of that sort.
Correct. And Pritimesh, one thing more, I just want to get your point of view that we talked in terms of Vietnam, which is to some extent is a very is totally dependent or somehow dependent on China. But when it comes to other big super powers in the globe, let's take the example of Japan and South Korea. So like these two countries have actually imposed a kind of a restriction on Chinese travelers coming into their country because of the spread of COVID-19 in China, and in kind of a kind of a retaliation to this move, China actually said that I'm not going to provide shuttle short-term, visas to the people coming from these countries. So how do you view this? That this kind of a strategy by China, is it going to backfire for China? When on one hand it is trying to opening up its market, but on the other hand, when people of other countries, especially developing nations, are trying to protect its citizens from another onslaught of COVID-19, this is how China is reacting to it.
You see, but the problem is that yes, what you are saying makes sense in the long term. Even in the long term, certain things can. I mean, if you look at the supply chains, if you look at the dependence, if you look at one is the politics, the other is the business communities. I mean, take the example of even India and China. There has been a lot of talk about, but it takes time to reduce your dependence. So that, and China is obviously leveraging that. And you made a very interesting point. There are also fault lines. East Asia is very complex. So Japan and South Korea also have problems between themselves, right? There are
Correct.
so China also, one is the economic dependence, the other is it also takes advantage when there are rifts. So I mean, at a global level, for instance, if you look at US and Russia and how China has leveraged that. In East Asia, it's very important that Japan and South Korea also get over because obviously there are historical differences over there also, and you would have over the past couple, in fact before COVID-19, there were issues about both countries in the area of tech. There were major differences and they were imposing restrictions. So that had happened while the trade wars were going on. This was so China obviously leverages that as well. But I think as we'll come, later, the point is that a lot depends upon what can this, this Indo-Pacific vision in terms of not just the Quad, but even the economic framework they've got, and whether this can be done. One is you obviously have to start with pilot projects, but at a certain stage there has to be some big ticket thinking.
Correct.
But for that it's very important that in East Asia the other fault lines are also addressed. You see, for instance, when you look at East, the first thing is when the US reached out to North Korea, even Japan was not very happy the way Trump, because Trump wanted to make it into more of a photo. That's what the Japanese felt. They were kept out of it. Then, as I mentioned earlier, if you look at Japan and South Korea, they need to withdraw because see now South Korea has also released its vision for the Indo-Pacific. Japan is a member of the Quad, so these issues need to be addressed. And obviously, once you're in a position, then you can also leverage. You can harness the sort of advantages which you have. So I would say that you're perfectly right that in the long run there are alternatives, but in the short run it's very tough. And China is obviously taking it. And very frankly, I really don't think actually neither China nor the rest of the world should get too much into zero-sum thinking. In fact, as is evident, in fact, the rest of the world also needs to look at the fact that, for instance, when you have these protests with regard to the COVID-19 restrictions, obviously there are differences within China also over the way Xi Jinping is approaching key, very important policy issues, be it domestic or be it foreign, right? And the sudden shift, from a rise which is sort of harmonious to the style which Xi Jinping is following is obviously there are analysts, there are scholars in China who are also not comfortable. So to sum it up, there are two things. One is obviously uh, if Xi Jinping, whether he's reactionary or whether at some point there is some amount of pragmatism, then he should probably look more at addressing domestic issues and reducing tensions and realize that this is not the time for conflict. And here I may add, I mean, one of the factors which is binding all the East Asian, South Korea, Japan, everyone, is the issue of Taiwan.
Correct.
So, Chinese aggression vis-a-vis Taiwan, that can be a binding factor. And I may also actually, there's a lot of potential for trilaterals if when you're looking at the supply chain. For
Correct.
instance, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea.
South Korea.
One is bilaterally, they're obviously doing it, but even trilaterals, and then that can be under the ambit of the Indo-Pacific, because often
Correct.
we get bogged down and think of the Indo-Pacific only in because every region also has its own dynamics at play. So that is something
Very
that
true.
can be done. But I think also at the end of the day, I think it's better that given the fact that there are so many non-security challenges, the rest of the world and China, they need to have working relationship. And here I may mention that it's not just China; even Russia should get over the zero sum, approach towards geopolitics. And
Correct.
just as an aside, in fact, the only country with which trade has really over the last year risen significantly is Russia. Actually, between China and Russia, that is something.
That's true. Though the war is taking place in Russia, but all of a sudden we see that there is a surge of, even though the Western powers have imposed a lot of sanctions on Russia, but we see that the trade has actually grown for Russia as far as be it energy sources or anything else. The trade for Russia has increased. But when we talk about in terms of, let's coming back to Asia and what is happening over here in the Indo-Pacific region also. So another big development that happened was that China, Japan, and United States of America have now thinking of building up their relations even more stronger. So how does this kind of a even more strengthening of Japan and USA coming closer is going to affect in terms of if we talk about the geopolitics with China?
So I think a few things. One, if you look at Kishida's visit now, I think today they'll have the Kishida and Biden are going to be having talks today. Actually, that's on the
Right.
13th. He's already visited, other European countries. He's visited UK. So this obviously is about. I think Japan can actually be a very important player, obviously in its own right, but also as a bridge between certain European countries and UK and the US, sorry, which have had differences because, for instance, France wants to have its own independent Indo-Pacific policy, which is not only directly targeted at China. Similarly, now if you look at Germany of late, its approach has been very different.
Right.
A most slightly more nuanced approach towards China. So Japan can actually bring in that, it is an important because the other Western countries also have very robust relationships with Japan. So I think Japan needs to be looked at in its own right. In fact,
Correct.
even earlier, and everybody knows that, but sometimes Japan is often linked very simplistically to its historic relationship with the US or in the context of the China factor. Now, this is,
Correct.
for instance, on the issue, just as an aside, I mean, on the issue of the Iran nuclear deal, Japan was one of the countries which was pushing US to get
Correct.
back on the table to negotiate because of their economic interests. Other East Asian countries also had that. So East
Right.
Asian countries like Japan, South Korea, they are now not just restricted to the region, and they cannot be looked at from the factor of China or North Korea or whatever. And Japan even more so because we know about that.
Correct.
Now, there was a bit of uncertainty. Obviously, at a strategic level, the relationship was secure, was very
Hmm.
strong and robust, even during the Trump administration. But
Correct.
this uh, Trump's emphasis on South Korea and Japan, paying more, contributing towards the sort of security which is provided by the US, that had
Correct.
become a sort of sticking point, and also Trump, the imposition of tariffs. So if you remember, you would be knowing that when the late Shinzo Abe had visited the US, there was a lot of talk about how Japan should create domestic jobs, and actually the Japanese actually tried to send out that message that some companies will be expanding their operations there and so on and so forth. Now, ever since Biden has come, there is a shift from that. And
Right.
generally, if you look at it, there is an emphasis on, less transactionalism with the allies. So, for instance, if you look at Article 5 of the treaty, Trump
Right.
was a bit ambivalent about it. Biden has been quite clear about it that in case there is any conflict, the US will step in, right? And there has not
Correct.
been much emphasis about on this issue that Japan and South Korea need to do more, for their own security and contribute towards it. That the
Right.
US, so he's not really so. So that is one thing. Then, the situation which is emerging, if you look at, for instance, they've discussed cooperation in space. The Taiwan factor is very important.
Right.
Then, obviously, if you look at it from the lens of the Indo-Pacific, the fact that both, I mean, after the US, probably Japan is the most important player in the Quad. And I may add that Japan has been the most consistent with regard to, the Indo-Pacific. So all this is there, and then obviously, you have a greater, the present Japanese Prime Minister has also realized, he's increased, the defense budget, and he also wants to leave a mark on the foreign policy, because for very long, actually, if you look at, obviously, late Shinzo Abe, he had a strong imprint on Japanese foreign, but largely there has been a continuity. There may have been differences on the degree to which you
Of course, there will always be a little bit of political differences when it comes to the foreign policies of each and every government. I do understand. We're a little bit short of time here. Before we end, I just want to get one, a message. Maybe what do you think about now Apple now officially coming to India? So we're talking about a lot of geopolitics, but yes, Apple now coming to India, planning to open its own kind of retail outlets here in India. How do you view this? Do you feel that now Apple has also realized that what has happened in China due to COVID-19, it's time to think India as a bigger market, and though they have a setup here in India, but now viewing India as a very whole market. I just want to get your views.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously they're beginning with the biggest, with Delhi and Mumbai. That is but natural, but obviously in terms of consumption, they realize that this is a very important market, and in fact, this has been for very long that realize it. But obviously, as you mentioned, you very rightly pointed out to the China factor, and that is probably. But I think the retail stores would have been there in the offing for very long. They would have been seeing the Indian market, seeing trends, and I mean, it would be interesting to see that at what stage they would already be thinking. But that, because tier 2 cities and tier 3 cities are also very important, by the way, in terms of consumption. And even if you look at the consumption, the purchase of smartphones, Apple and so on and so forth. So there is an interest even over there. So it would be interesting to see that. And also, obviously, they have shifted some of the production, but the real thing would also be to see that how much production do they shift to India. And but I think this is obviously, it's a recognition of
course, and we'll definitely see in the coming times, Devesh, that how a company like Apple is now expanding into India, and as you aptly put, like it's not just only tier 2 and tier 3, and not just tier 1, but tier 2 and tier 3 cities also. That would be the big market for Apple, as the purchasing power in India is increasing. Well, on that note,
just one point before I end, I think also now, how much would Apple want to invest in R&D in India? That's also something. I mean, there's a lot of potential actually for that, beyond just the production and beyond the looking at it as a consumption. There's potential for a strong knowledge economy, especially in certain parts of India. So that is something also which.
True. Well, on that note, thank you, Devesh, for joining me on Global Chit Chat and sharing your insight about what is happening across the globe. And thank you once again. And if our viewers, if you want to comment about what we are discussing, and if you have some few suggestions, do mention in the comment section below. And once again, thank you, Devesh, for joining me on Global Chit Chat.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you very much.